I've been replaying Pokemon Scarlet Violet, and it's a good example of an uncanny game world, and I want to explain how relatively small inconsistencies can end up creating a game environment that just feels a little bit off or weird to players, and why that matters, or why you should care. When Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was released, it received pretty bad reviews for technical issues particularly related to the graphics, as well as for a lot of visual bugs and poor optimization. It was criticised for poor visual design, poor asset quality, basic textures, things like that. Now I'm playing this on the original Switch, but the release of an updated version on the Switch 2, with better hardware, actually makes this a really good time to revisit some of these issues. The Switch 2 version has largely polished out all of the technical issues with the graphics, and it's improved the resolutions, there's more consistent frame rates. But what that's done really is shine a light on the underlying environmental design and some of the inconsistencies in it, even more without these technical distractions. I'm going to take you through some quick examples of where Pokemon Scarlet and Violet gets things slightly wrong in environmental design, and why that creates this uncanny feeling for players where they don't quite believe the game world. What one reviewer described as like being grabbed by the scruff of the neck and given a good shake. I really like this description because it really captures the feeling of an immersion breaking moment for a player and takes them out of the experience of playing the game and makes them pay attention to the game world in maybe an undesirable way. So this is Area 1, just past the first Pokemon Center early on in the game, and this is where we've just kind of got the opportunity to start exploring the open world a little bit. And you can see we've got these rolling grasslands here, some trees scattered throughout the landscape, and these high cliffs surrounding us. Now, it doesn't look great by the standard of AAA games, but most of the comments on it in reviews focus on the general impression of the landscape, using terms like bland, uninspired. Where people get more specific, they talk about low quality textures, poor asset quality, crude geometry, things like that. Now, although those criticisms aren't wrong, the real problem in this landscape is a lack of coherency and realism. Now, crucially here, I don't mean that it's not detailed enough. This isn't about visual quality, it's about design and environmental coherency. So if we dive into this landscape, one of the first things we notice is these big cliffs surrounding this valley. And the use of red-brown textures here suggests a kind of sandstone, and that's reflected in some of the smaller kind of outcroppings of bare earth, the kind of paths within the landscape. Most players aren't going to pick up on that, and they aren't going to care. They don't care that it's sandstone. But what our brains do all the time is a kind of pattern matching. So we see something, and our brains try and match it to something we're already familiar with, and that gives us a sense of comfort. And where we can't subconsciously pattern match to something we're used to, we're more likely to have our attention drawn to it. And this is a very base human instinct, it's about looking for things that are just a little bit out of place, because that could be a source of danger or a predator. So it's something that we're really conditioned to do almost genetically. In most applications of games or visual effects design, we want the environment or the game world to sort of fade into the background, to be the backdrop to the action that's actually taking place. And if players' attention is drawn towards it, we want that to be a positive thing. We want the players to be thinking, wow, or like, oh, that's an amazing kind of vista, I should take a screenshot. Not kind of thinking, what's that supposed to be, what's going on there. So going back to these cliffs, the textures are suggesting sandstone, but that's a fairly soft, kind of crumbly rock, and we'd expect the geometry in the cliffs would be a lot more varied, it'd be a lot smoother, and all of the material that's been eroded away from the cliffs, that would be deposited down near the base of the cliff. The cliffs to sort of blend into the floor of the valley would have kind of foothills, if you like, at the base of the cliff. And that's the exact opposite to what we've got in this environment, where we've got these near vertical cliffs with an abrupt transition between the cliff texture and the grass texture in the base of the valley. And looking around at the vegetation a bit more widely, we've got this fairly lush grass and a scattering of large mature trees. And these look like kind of oak or beech trees, kind of deciduous. That's quite different to what we'd expect with a more sandstone environment, especially as this Pokemon region's inspired by southern Spain. That's sunny, it's warm, that's reflected in the game environment. You've got these blue skies, it's suggesting a really warm, kind of semi-arid region. And with sandstone, the ground wouldn't keep much rainfall. The vegetation would be a lot sparser, it'd be a lot less lush, less intense green colours, and the trees would have more variety. They wouldn't necessarily be all these kind of large park type trees. They'd be more likely to grow in the sheltered spaces where water retained in the landscape, away from this harsh kind of unending sunlight, so it's easier for them to grow. The placement as they are now is more suggesting something like parkland, grounds of a sort of stately home in a more temperate part of Europe or North America. We've got boulders, kind of rock outcrops to add some visual interest in the floor of the valley. But again, these are very different to any kind of rocks we can see in the cliffs. These are large grey boulders, suggesting something kind of granite, maybe glacial deposits. So overall, if we look at all the key parts of this landscape, we've got the surrounding rocks, the geology, the shape of the landscape features and the vegetation, and they're all clashing with each other. They're not giving this sense of coherence within the landscape, and that's always going to feel wrong when people look at it. And importantly, this can't be addressed by higher quality graphics or assets or improving the hardware. It needs a coherent landscape design to fit everything together and avoid this sense of the uncanny, of the unusual, of the weird when a player looks at it. But the flip side of this is it means that these issues can be somewhat fixed without dramatically needing to improve the hardware or improve the technical optimization, or even in hiring bigger, larger development teams and just pouring much more money into the game development. So as an example, if I was brought in to advise on this environment at a fairly late stage in development, so we're kind of pretty restricted in what we can do, say the environmental geometry is already kind of baked in, we don't have time or money to go back and redo large parts of the game. So what we're looking for is the lowest cost, simplest fixes that are going to deliver the biggest impact in terms of improving player perception of the visual quality of the landscape. So the first thing I'd recommend is changing the colour of the cliff textures. Now, I've mentioned that this type of geometry here isn't right for sandstone, but it is just about passable for a more limestone environment. So we're talking about off-white, light grey, pale yellow type textures. And limestone is harder, partly erodes through water, so what we'd expect is much more vertical type cliffs and a slight sculpting, kind of fluting vertical features in the geometry. And such an environment does exist in southern Spain. There are areas of limestone cliffs, places like El Tocal, the Ronda Valley. And this fits with some other landscape features as well, so this pond is a nice example of something which just doesn't work with a sandstone type environment, but is very kind of characteristic of the sort of sinkholes that we'd see in a limestone environment. It's a very kind of characteristic sinkhole type pond. And it would also match with the random boulders that are scattered around the valley floor. It would then be the same type of rock. And it may even have been what was intended early on in the development process. So changing the colour of the cliffs and the exposed earth would have a massive effect. But if we had a bit more time and resource, I'd recommend altering the vegetation as well. And at the simplest level, just changing the grass textures and assets to lose some of the saturation. So changing them from this kind of quite bright, vivid green to a paler, yellower green, indicating a more arid environment with less water available. Going a little bit further, we could make the grass a little bit sparser. Perhaps changing the ground texture from being green to being a kind of grey colour that matches changed cliffs, and then having the movable grass assets on top of that. So it looks like grass growing in a sort of sparse way on top of bare earth, and making areas of completely bare earth as well within the valley floor. And we could then make the trees a little bit smaller, change the placement to reflect them growing in slightly more sheltered locations, and add in some smaller kind of bush and shrub assets as well to add a bit of vertical variation. Finally, in terms of fairly simple fixes, again without dramatically changing too much from the original, adding in some horizontal lines, sort of darker grey to the cliffs to indicate layering in the rock, and maybe some vertical cracks as well as a simple way of adding detail that indicates limestone cliff. And this could be done by just changing the textures rather than actually putting those vertical or horizontal variations into the underlying geometry to kind of trick the eye into believing that there's a greater degree of variation. Now, the Pokemon series of games are obviously not aiming for stunning visual, and so you might think that this type of landscape optimization is kind of redundant. I'd actually argue the opposite. What Pokemon needs is for the game world to not get in the way of the gameplay, and that's what's happening at the moment. And the best way to ensure that for Pokemon or any game that doesn't want to invest a lot of time and money in developing really high quality visuals is through optimizing the design. And by focusing on a really coherent landscape design, it means developers don't have to use the highest quality textures, they can use simpler assets and focus on constructing a consistent game world that fades into the background and lets the gameplay, lets the Pokemon design, lets the battles come to the fore, and let the players focus on those aspects rather than noticing details of the game world. Obviously this is a pretty niche topic, so I'm not trying to get hundreds of subscribers here. With this channel, I want to give the likes of game developers and environmental artists insights into how landscapes work and tips and tricks on how to build immersive virtual worlds. So if that sounds of interest, you know how YouTube works, press the various buttons. Feel free to drop me any questions in the comments, or hit me up on social media or email, and check out some of my other videos.